morning. As we struggle to weather and survive the many environmental storms that surround us today, including climate change and its many consequences, including the extinction of numerous species, I think one of the things that we have to do fundamentally and first of all, in order to succeed against these particular challenges, is to change the way we look at the world. Fundamentally, I think that we have to set aside those conventional dualities of objective and subjective perception and start looking at the world in a new way, in a third sort of vision. It's a vision that, on one level, must be critical. It must be informed. It must be intelligent. It must also, at the same time, be compassionate. It must also feel a certain empathy for what it is that we're looking at. It must have integrity. It must be inclusive. A couple of years ago, as I stood above the base camp of Mount Everest and looked across at the sun coming up over the South Pole, I was struck by that particular moment, the way in which I felt I was looking into the eye of creation. Creation not necessarily in a religious or biblical sense of creation, but creation in the sense of the very basic elements of sunlight, air, water, earth, that come together to create life and sustain life. It was a moment of profound significance for me. It was also a moment in which I understood my own insignificance at that particular time, both as an individual and as a human species. Naturalists look at the world in many different ways, but for the most part, naturalists look at the world through the lens of defining, differentiating different species. They look for the differences that there are in nature. So for instance, when they look at a blue poppy, one of the most spectacular flowers in the Himalaya, they, of course, notice its color, they notice its shape, they notice its size, they notice where it grows. And then they compare and contrast it to other species that grow nearby, such as the buttercup in the background or the lousewort there. So the naturalist inherently is looking at those differences and separating those species into different categories and classifications. That's how the taxonomy of nature works. But at the same time, I believe the naturalist is also looking at the unity of nature, what it is that we share with other species on this earth, even plants and non-sentient beings. There's an interesting expression called the hunter's trance. The hunter's trance, I think, is illustrated by this photograph of an archer in Bhutan who's taking aim at a target. The idea behind the hunter's trance is that at that moment, when you have pulled the drawstring back and you're holding your arrow ready to release it, the hunter and his prey become one. There is a connection between the predator and the prey at that particular moment. Now, paradoxically, many writers like E.O. Wilson who have used the hunter's trance as a way of talking about the naturalist's gaze. So as the naturalist is looking at the blue poppy or whatever other species he or she is studying, there is that connectedness with that particular species. Of course, very few people in the world today depend on hunting for their survival. It's become an anachronistic pursuit. In many cases, people hunt simply for sport or to collect trophies, like this rather sad-looking snow leopard that I photographed in northern Pakistan. But what is happening here, if you look at this stuffed snow leopard, which to my eye is utterly phony and unconvincing, the taxidermist has tried to reproduce the hunter's trance, or that gaze. In those glass eyes, there is that piercing look that connects with us. And yet, in this instance, because of many reasons, the ethics of hunting today, it has become a perversion and perhaps even an obscenity. This camera trap image from the Jebel Cave Nature Reserve is of a leopard. Its eyes reflect the flash of the camera trap, which illuminates its presence there in the forest. The camera has become a wonderful tool for naturalists in order to document, study, and preserve these encounters with wildlife. And of course, in this instance, there was no human being there. The leopard took its own photograph. The first thing that we have to understand about our perception of nature, the way we look at the world around us, is that those species that we are looking at are looking back at us. Here we have a spectacular bird called the black-necked crane, which breeds in Ladakh and parts of the Tibetan Plateau, and then migrates during winter to places like the Pojika Valley, where I photographed them in Bhutan. They are absolutely unique as a species, and yet they share the migratory routes of other birds as well. They share our migratory routes as well, as shepherds and other human beings move up and across the mountains as well. What fascinates me about this photograph is because of the position of the crane's eyes, it can only look at me at this point with one eye. But this bird pairs for life, and there are all sorts of romantic associations with that. But as they look at me, the two of them together, they look at me almost as if they were a single creature meeting my gaze. You could say the same thing about these two wedge-tailed green pigeons that I photographed very close to here, again in the Jebel Cave Nature Reserve. They're looking at me with a certain amount of caution, and they're looking at me with a certain amount of alarm. As a naturalist, again, I look at them to differentiate them from other species. For example, I see the wedge-tail, which is part of their name. I see the lovely lavender hue on their wings. But most importantly, I see the scarlet feet clutching the branch, which differentiates them from the yellow-footed green pigeon, a similar species. So the naturalist is constantly differentiating between one species and another. Now, in Buddhist, Bon, and Hindu iconography, when we have supernatural beings, deities, like this Garuda or Garur figure from Tawang Monastery in Arunachal Pradesh, much of the power of that deity lies in its eyes. And when a devotee approaches a deity in a temple, whether it be Buddhist or Hindu, and in many cases others, the deity and the devotee meet each other's gaze. And in that sense, the devotee becomes part of that divinity. It's exactly the same thing as the hunter's trance that I explained before. It's also fascinating the way in which religious iconography borrows from nature. The Garur figure, of course, is a familiar character in much mythology. He is, of course, the winged vehicle of Lord Vishnu, but he is also the enemy or the protector against snakes and serpents, which he has clutched between his beak here. This is a streaked laughing thrush from my garden here in Mandower. And just like the Garur, he holds not a serpent but a caterpillar in his beak. And as he looks at me, there's very much a sense that that spark of life that animates him also animates me. He also seems perfectly capable of carrying God on his wings. Here, encircled by the watery mirror of the Kaveri River in Seringapatam, this otter has just risen to the surface after diving for fish. And as he watches me and I watch him, again, I'm conscious of the fact that we have to change the way we perceive these creatures, because for too long, whether it's science, whether it's religion, whether it's poetry, whatever discipline you choose, human beings have tried to set them apart, set themselves apart from nature, to stand above, to elevate themselves, and in a sense assert their dominion over other species. And yet, if we are to succeed in surviving the environmental storms that we face today, we must recognize something of ourselves in this creature who is so very different from us in many, many ways. When we come face to face with an animal in the wild, we are watching them, but they are also watching us. And not only are they watching us, this somber doe has every one of her senses attuned to my presence. And she is evaluating whether I am a threat or not to her or her fawn, who lies outside the frame of this picture. She's watching me, but she's also listening to me. She's also smelling me. She's not tasting me, perhaps. But nevertheless, she is absolutely focused on me. And I then, as I look at her, become aware of the fact that my senses, my five senses, are far less acute than hers. And she understands me perhaps better than I understand myself. This pica, a small mouse hare, common rodent in the high Himalaya, when I photographed him in the Songar Valley, it took about 45 minutes to an hour before he was willing to come out within about 6 feet of me and allow himself to be photographed. And I had to be very patient. Eventually, his curiosity got the better of him, and he came out. And as I released the shutter on my camera, it was, in many ways, a moment that was as profound as the sun rising over the south col of Everest. You are looking into the eye of creation. You understand that even in the presence of a diminutive creature like this, you yourselves are simply one more species amongst millions. In Buddhist teaching, they tell us that the human mind is like the monkey that resists the stillness of meditation. The human mind jumps from branch to branch. It's restless. It refuses to sit still. And yet this golden langur, which I photographed in the Royal Manas National Park at the foot of the mountains in Bhutan, he appears to be sitting in complete meditation, complete and calm contemplation. More than likely, he's looking at his mate in the tree up above, because their lovely cream-colored coat turns a striking gold during the breeding season, as you can see in the colors in this picture. In the animal kingdom, we are part of the family of primates. And for that reason, we have our closest affinity with apes like this, for we are apes ourselves. Any naturalist will tell you that when you enter the forest, when you enter the wild, there are places you cannot go. There are certain territories that belong to others. Just as this elephant demonstrates as he conducts a mock charge to warn me that you're welcome, but you're not welcome beyond this particular point. His small, determined, but certainly attentive eyes signal that warning as well. And I realize that we share common ground, but we each need to be able to recognize each other's space. This tigress that I photographed in the Tadoba National Park, or the Tadoba Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh. When I look at the photograph, I often think that she is asking me the question, why are you looking at me? And I think it's a fundamental question. Why do we want to see a tiger? Everybody that goes to a wildlife reserve in India, the first thing they want to do is see the tiger. But why? On one level, I would argue that it is just like the hunter who shoots the snow leopard. There is bragging rights associated with it. There is the ability to go home and say, I saw a tiger, which is all very well. There's nothing, it's certainly not as destructive as shooting a snow leopard. But at the same time, it is an inquisitive, a selfish way of looking at this creature. Whereas instead, I would argue that we need to be able to look at an animal like this, first of all, to understand and appreciate the diversity of nature, to recognize how different it is from us, but at the same time, to understand that this species and our species share this planet and must, in a sense, coexist. Several weeks ago, I was walking through the Jabbar Cake Nature Reserve, and I was intent on finding a particular plant. There's an insectivorous plant called Drosera peltata, which catches insects and feeds on them. And I was looking for that, but my attention was entirely on the ground as I walked along the top of the ridge. And then at a certain point, I looked up, and through the fork in the tree, this guru was looking at me. He had seen me before I had seen him. And our eyes met for a few moments. He wasn't quite sure whether I posed a threat or not. I was able to take 3 photographs. He sneezed in alarm and ran down the hill. As I look at that photograph and as I recall that memory of that encounter with him, I understood very clearly that, as I say, we have to look at nature through different eyes because of the challenges we face today. And we must also recognize that the survival of our species depends fundamentally on his survival, the survival of his species. Thank you.